story of Ezra requires a little background to set the stage. During the Great Exodus, God taught the Hebrew nation essential principles for everyday living for His godly people. But once the nation became settled into the Promised Land, these principles seemed less important to them. The people drifted away from God's laws. Finally, God lifted His mantle of protection and allowed aggressive enemy forces to come after the Jewish people. First it was the Assyrians, then the Babylonians. The Babylonians ultimately overran the entire Jewish settlements in the Jerusalem area. The Babylonians pummeled the capital city of Jerusalem for nearly 20 years after the city of Jerusalem ceased paying tribute to Babylon. We can read about that in 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25. Many of the leaders of Jerusalem were exiled to Babylon, and finally the city and the temple were completely destroyed. Many years passed, and then the Persians defeated Babylon. At that time, the Jewish people were allowed to begin returning to their homeland to start the rebuilding process of their war-torn city. More than 100 years before that point in time, the prophet Isaiah had foretold that there would come a time when a king named Cyrus would say of Jerusalem, "Let it be rebuilt," and of the temple, "Let its foundations be laid." That's in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28. As you would expect, the first king of Persia was named Cyrus, and he issued a proclamation allowing the Jews to return to the city of Jerusalem to rebuild the city and its temple. Moreover, the prophet Jeremiah had foretold that when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place, Jerusalem. That's Jeremiah 29, verse 10. Well, God made good on His prophecies. By 516 BC, the temple reconstruction was completed, notwithstanding the numerous disruptions and stalled efforts that had happened along the way that we can read about in Ezra chapters 4 and 5. Although the temple was reconstructed, a culture of faith and obedience to God's laws had not yet been restored. After the temple had been rebuilt, Ezra led a group of nearly 2,000 people to repopulate the city of Jerusalem. This 900-mile trek took some 4 months to complete and had the backing of the king of Persia, King Artaxerxes, who provided a letter authorizing the passage of the people, and the king had also made provisions for the journey. He provided gold and silver for the temple, and he returned to Ezra the implements that had been stolen by King Nebuchadnezzar years before from the temple in Jerusalem. We read that in the 7th chapter of Ezra, verses 12 through 26. Ezra was a direct descendant of Aaron, who was the chief priest under Moses, Ezra 7:5. Ezra was passionate about studying and teaching the law of Moses. He became a priest in Jerusalem, and it was his humble leadership as a scholar and teacher of Jewish law that was the key to bringing back a culture of devotion to God's laws. Shortly after his arrival in Jerusalem, Ezra became distressed to learn that many of the Israelites, including their leaders in the temple, had violated God's laws against intermarriage with members of pagan cultures that surrounded the area. We read of that in Ezra chapter 9, verse 1. God's laws expressly forbade such intermarriage. We read that in Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and 4, for example. When the Hebrew nation had entered the Promised Land, they'd been forewarned against intermarriage with people from foreign cultures because those marriages would become traps for the Jewish nation. Read, for example, Joshua chapter 23, verses 12 and 13. Ezra recognized the error of their ways. He repented for his people and he explained the significance of their sins. He called for corrective action to be taken. This was not a racial division. The Jews and the foreigners were all Semites. Rather, it was a matter of becoming unequally yoked with non-believers that would result in compromises between husbands and wives and eventually would undermine the Jewish faith. Moreover, Ezra pointed out that God's blessing in reestablishing the temple was an empty gesture if obedience to God's laws did not follow. As a result of Ezra's leadership, many who had taken foreign wives divorced them. We read that in Ezra 10, verses 10 through 17. The spiritual leadership of Ezra was evidenced in the book of Nehemiah as well as the book of Ezra. After the city wall had been resecured, the priest Ezra was the one who led the people in the reading of the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, read them aloud in the city square, followed by a celebration celebrating the standards that God had established. That's in the 8th chapter of Nehemiah. Ezra was a devout student and teacher of God's laws and decrees. The story of Ezra raises some interesting points for reflection. Consider these with me, if you will. Number 1, Ezra shows that the influence of one devout person can turn the tide for an entire community. You could be that person in your family, neighborhood, place of work, church. What is it that you are doing to be a godly influence to others? Question number 2 for reflection. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, the Apostle Paul instructed, "Do not be yoked together with unbelievers." Now, Ezra had applied this concept when he lamented the Hebrews' intermarriage with pagans. When deciding with whom work, social affiliations, what godly standards do you require for such affiliations? And what standards risk compromise? Third question for reflection. Ezra suggested that the sins of a few can affect the faith of the entire community. What sins are potentially damaging to your faith community and to the church? Ezra was a student of God's laws, and he was a teacher of those laws and decrees. He was a priest among his people. The leadership of one devout person can change the course for an entire community of believers. Be one of those persons who are contributing a positive, godly influence for the people around you.